Hi there, welcome to Lesson 4. I hope you enjoyed the first half of the class nearly as much as I have. If you enjoyed it anywhere near as much as I did, then you're really liking it. I certainly hope that's the case. Moving on, we're going to spend the second half of the class in the 20th and 21st centuries. So if you think about that time-wise with what we've studied so far, the pace is really slowing down, which I think is good. I think we're moving a little faster than I would have liked, but that was just the only way to do it to achieve two goals. One, move chronologically, and two, look at the authors who are the best authors, the most representative authors of their time periods and cultures. So with the slower pace, the reading will be a little bit less and the lectures will be a little bit shorter. With this first part of Lesson 4, though, it will be kind of long because we're going to talk about modernism, which is definitely the most complex and nebulous literary movement we'll have looked at so far. We've looked at the Enlightenment, Romanticism, Realism. Every literary movement is nuanced and complex, especially realism, which, as I pointed out, still really has sway today. But modernism emerged out of what I would argue is one of the most difficult periods in our world history. And so the movement is equally complex. And the story we're going to look at in this first part of Lesson 4, Liu Jun's Diary of a Madman, is very representative of modernism and of that dark new world from which modernism emerged. So we've got quite a bit of ground to cover. But after this first lecture, after we cover the fundamentals of modernism, things will really slow down, and you'll have lectures that are half an hour or shorter. So with modernism, I've actually divided it into two parts for two separate slides. One slide is modernity, and another slide is modernism. It was just too much to try to fit on one slide, as I usually do when I cover a literary movement and its historical context. One of the best definitions I've ever heard of modernism is from Dr. Tony Flynn, one of our other professors here at EWU, who you may have had before. He's a wonderful professor. And he specialized in the modern period, and he calls modernism an aesthetic response to modernity. Think about that for a second. An aesthetic response to modernity. So we've talked about modernity already, simply the condition of being modern. And we've talked a lot about what that means in some of our other lectures. And we've looked at pieces, for instance, Goethe's Faust and Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, that really meditate on what it means to be modern. So we've got a fairly decent definition of modernity, an aesthetic response to modernity. So aesthetic as in the arts, in this case specifically literature, and then that term response. Modernity was is still such a powerful condition that it necessitated an aesthetic or literary response. And so, like I said, we've covered quite a bit of what it means to be modern. And part of the reason we're going from 1650 on forward in this class is that beginning in the late 17th century, I believe you can really start to see the emergence of a truly modern world. However, the early 20th century ushered in some massive sweeping changes that ratcheted up the powerful effect of modernity. So we're going to look at those changes on one slide called Modernity, will be the title of that slide. And then the second slide will be Modernism. So we'll look at the conditions, and then we'll look at the nature of the literary response to those conditions, if that makes sense. And I chose this picture here, and I wanted to linger on the slide because it shows trench warfare during World War I. World War I was one of the biggest, if not the biggest, catalyst for the massive effect that modernity produced in the early 20th century. In World War I and some of the innovations in warfare that were part of World War I, such as mustard gas, and in this image, trench warfare, those things are really emblematic of the 20th century conditions of modernity. So, enough preamble. Take a look first at modernity. In the early 20th century, the world was interconnected as never before. We talked about this a little bit. Basically, the last 2 or 3 literary movements at which we've looked in this class, the world has been becoming more and more interconnected. We saw that begin with the globalism, that was an effect of imperialism. And we saw how in the late 19th century, it helped realism emerge by bringing writers together. It just increased because now you have things like airplanes in addition to steamships. You also have improvements in communication, healthcare, urbanity. Um, People are living in cities and traveling across the globe and communicating with people across the globe, really for the first time at the dawn of the 20th century. Um, a lot of that is good, right? A lot of that is positive change. And I always use the analogy of the technology we see today, such as smartphones. There's a lot of positives that come with those. However, there are also a lot of drawbacks. And so huge advancements in technology always have positives and drawbacks. So the drawbacks are you have like efficiency is kind of the central theme here. So as transportation, communication, healthcare become more efficient, so do weapons. And that was one of the things that I think really shocked people. Before the 20th century, wars were experienced very, very differently by those who were not a direct part of them, who were not a soldier or a medic or someone who was on the front lines. They were distant. People read about them, and they were, in actuality, probably not very humane, but to the perception of the everyday person, fairly humane. But basically, at the same time the car and the airplane were invented, automatic weapons, machine guns, and biological weapons, mustard gas were also invented. And what people saw at the beginning of the 20th century for the first time was highly efficient ways to kill lots of people very fast and tremendous loss of life in World War I. So one way to say it would be that human connection also leads to human conflict. We've talked about that question, that's at the center of Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, is, the human condition. Are human beings naturally good or are they naturally evil? And, there's a lot of evidence both ways. That's something we can really debate. That's a good debate to have. But you definitely see the evidence for human nature being evil in the early 20th century, because as humans were drawn closer together through the interconnectedness of the modern world, inevitably that greater human connection led to greater human conflict. And estimates have it as 200 million people who died in the 20th century through wars, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, etc., as well as the mass genocides in Germany with the Holocaust, and then in communist Russian China with the mass execution of people under Stalin and Russian under Mao in China. And so you see these 2 world wars, the other wars in Korea and Vietnam, and the 3 instances of mass genocide in Germany, Russia, and China in the 20th century is like no other century we've seen before. The modern human person has a different burden to carry because of the 20th century. And I think this is why in the 20th century you see more people falling away from religion and from other things they'd believed in and held on to in the past. And this is why it launched such a complex, nuanced, nebulous literary movement. The task of the writer since the beginning of time, since poets first spoke the story of Gilgamesh aloud, or Moses wrote the early books of the Bible. Since that time, it has always been the writer's responsibility to respond to the world around them. That's part of my teaching philosophy, or my philosophy of literature, as you remember. And so that task was irrecoverably changed by the mass deaths and other modern conditions of the 20th century. So what were some of the other things that happened? Well, the sun set on all European empires as the world system they dominated experienced crises. And crisis, or in its plural form, crises, is one of the key terms to know for understanding modernity. So you had World War I, but more especially World War II, took so many resources to fight and repel the Nazis that Britain, France, and other countries who had these massive empires, their empires collapsed, and countries such as India, Nigeria, etc., started to gain their independence following World War II, which is a good thing. But you can't simply go back to the way things were before imperialism, and so existence there is you'd have to say arguably better than under imperial rule, but certainly tainted by it, not pure in any form. And so we're living in a post-colonial world. And in the next two lessons, we'll look at some specifically post-colonial writers. What were some of the other crises? As I mentioned, 2 world wars. There was also the Russian Revolution and the revolution in China, where the previous totalitarian monarchical forms of government were overthrown by revolutions, and communist governments were put into place. You had the Great Depression in the U.S., and other economic depressions throughout the world. And of course, as I mentioned, the Holocaust and the other genocides that took place following those revolutions in Russia and China. And so not only did these, compared to centuries past, not only were these things an inspiration for the writers or something the writers felt they needed to respond to, they also became the direct focus of the lit, the actual subject matter. There was kind of a closeness where you'd have actual, novels like Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, where you have, a World War I veteran dealing with PTSD. So there's kind of a direct connection, more direct than before, I would say, between the world events and the literature responding to them. Of all of these things, I think the First World War was the most shocking, probably, to people. I mean, I don't really want to debate that, but it was just so different than anything people had experienced before. It was the first of these crises, and the reason it was so different, it was the most mechanized war to date. That's a term to really remember. You think about, when I teach this in the classroom, I often ask, trying to put students in the frame of mind of what would it be like to live in the early 20th century and to experience modernity. I'd say, imagine you've never seen a car before. You're used to walking places or riding in a horse-drawn carriage, and then you see a car going down the street. Imagine what that would be like. Now take that same capacity for imagination and take that same idea of new technology and apply it to finding ways to killing people more efficiently. And mechanization, that term really encapsulates and represents modernity, and really encapsulates and represents the crisis World War I put to the rest of the world. It wasn't just that it was the first world war that involved all of these countries. It wasn't just that it was one of the first wars where people really knew what was happening because of the telegraph, the ability to receive news faster. It was one of the first wars where people were killed on the battlefield in incredibly inhumane ways with incredibly technologically advanced weapons that kill people very efficiently. That's a shock to the system. kind of moving along, we looked at World War One. Let's look at the second bullet point under crises there, the Russian Revolution. So Russia was nearly defeated in World War One, and that made the monarchy vulnerable and susceptible to the revolution. So the revolution that people in Dostoevsky's time foresaw coming arrived. Um, and then what happened is you have a communist government installed. And one of the issues with that system is it's a very centralized, regulated government. In the US, we have a very decentralized government where the states have a lot of power and different states can make decisions. That's not part of communist society. Everything has to be regulated. It seems very promising. It seems like people will all be equal. The problem is to keep it running, you have to have a select few people in power. And so it comes back to that question of are humans naturally good or evil? And, you put, just a few select people in power with the obligation of running everything and keeping everyone equal, and that power corrupts, and you have the result is Stalin. So, again, there's a lot to this. I'm actually trying to go as fast as I can to unpack as much of it as I can for you without taking up too much time. We could spend a whole another hour discussing this, but I think you get the idea of what some of these changes were. You also had, I'll be my last bullet point for the conditions of modernity, the end of World War One, setting the stage for World War Two, and that's kind of where this historical context takes us, 1900 to 1945, through the end of World War II. So in the next lecture, after we look at these four authors, the next set of authors we'll look at from 1946 on forward, and decolonization and things like that happened after World War II. But the end of World War I set the stage for World War II, part because of Germany's defeat. The Allied forces demanded reparations, which is basically where the loser in a war kind of pays out to the winners, to the victors. And after World War I, Germany was this bankrupt country. And so that created the opportunity for Hitler to seize power. I mean, Hitler was awful, the things he did. But if you look at the context of Germany and its economic state after World War I, and you can see how, at least initially, people would have followed Hitler because he was incredibly charismatic and had incredibly efficient policies and helped restore the country to economic prominence. Obviously the problem was from there, he went on to world domination and horrible atrocities. But you can see kind of how the end of World War I paved the way for someone like that with those kinds of intentions to take control. And so this is the modern world. I mean, imagine, we're living in strange times now. Imagine living in those times and you get to a text like Diary of a Madman. Before we jump there, let's take just a little bit more time and talk about the literary movement of which Diary of a Madman was a part. And we can see how a text like Diary of a Madman is a quintessentially modern text. So I've given one definition of modernism as an aesthetic response to modernity, and we've just seen what modernity is. So let's see what that aesthetic response looked like for many authors. I'm going to start by giving you one more definition of modernism, which is the definition the textbook gives, and I think it's a pretty darn good one. So modernism would be a literary or aesthetic or artistic search for a type of society to replace broken pre-war consensus. So with everything we just talked about with modernity, you can think of the world as fractured or broken, split into pieces. A lot of the ideals people held on to before have been shattered by World War I, by the Holocaust, by modernity. And so with those broken ideals, what do we have left? Fragments, pieces. And so much of the literary and art produced literary works and art produced during the 20th century were an effort or an attempt to try to pull together those pieces, those fragments. And the word consensus there is really important. I'm going to use the word cohesive later on, which is important because before World War I, you had more of a consensus. You had people had a lot of common ground on things. Now, this says search for a type of society, a new type of society. So people were not trying to go back to the old ways. World War I shattered a previous existence, how people conceptualize their existence, and so you could not go back to that. Almost like you can't go back to, pre-colonial time once you're in a post-colonial period. So you can't go back. But what was promising about what was there before was some cohesiveness, society working together. Now society is fragmented. So what kind of new society could also be cohesive? You could say that's the modernist dream. And one of the questions that goes along with this is that even possible? Or is the reward more in the striving? And so a lot of the work, perhaps all of it, never really shows us what that cohesive society looks like. We might still be looking for it to this day, you could argue, but there's such a powerful attempt to find it, to describe it, that you have some really amazing pieces of literature that emerge. And that literature does give people some hope, I think. So what did that literature look like? Well, we saw in the last slide that there was political crises. So there's also a crisis of representation, which means a move away from realism. Rather than, writers were still trying to depict the world as it is. But the realist writers, as you saw, used very formal structures for the most part. So there was all kinds of experimentation in writing, really for the first time, where people would try new techniques, new structures. Plot went out the window. The narrative didn't matter as much. It was all about the art itself and how could we develop a new kind of art. So this experimentation led to avant-garde movements. Some of the literary works of modernism are the most highbrow works you'll ever see. Think of James Joyce, William Faulkner, Virginia Woolf, D.H. Lawrence, etc. And that was because if there's a question as to whether you can even find your goal, a new version of a cohesive society, if you're not even sure that's possible, then it's not so much the end point that's significant, it's the journey that's significant. And so the art itself, the quality and complexity and nuance of the art itself, rather than a happy ending, is what gave people hope. And so you had like the most avant-garde kind of highbrow literature, some of it ever produced. And that's why people kind of look back on the modernist movement as being a little bit stuffy sometimes. So what were some of these literary experiments? I'm sorry, I accidentally had that bullet point on there twice. I realized I wanted to move it to the top and didn't remove it from down here. So what were some of these experiments? Well, the crisis of representation we're talking about here really emerged out of a crisis of reason that began in the 19th century. So you had things that, like a pronounced crisis in faith in Victorian England after Charles Darwin's theory of evolution emerged. So people were starting to lose their faith then. They were starting to question it because of science. If science caused people to initially question their faith and many people to fall away, then suffering caused even more people to fall away and people to question it much more thoroughly, as I kind of mentioned before. So a lot of the kind of intellectual aspect of the sweeping changes in modernity had begun earlier, and then the catastrophic events like World War I called it a catalyst earlier, ushered in that change. 19th century realism had a balance of inner and outer worlds, kind of equal time spent on describing what was going on in the character's mind and the world around that character, the modernist focus shifted it. There was no longer a balance. It all became what was going on in the character's mind. So interiority is a phrase often associated with modernism. It really looks at what's going on in the character's mind. That's why I said plot kind of goes out the window. It's all focused on character and their psychological state. I mean, it would be obvious for all the reasons stated on the previous slide why writers would focus on this, but you also have like the emergence of psychoanalysis with Freud's ideas coming out for the first time at the modern psychology emerging for the first time at the beginning of the 20th century. One of the things you'd often see in the text is unreliable narrators becoming more the norm. So you might have a few texts like, for instance, Notes from Underground and the realist movement that had unreliable narrators, or Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights is a good example. But that was kind of the abnormal thing or the exception during realism. The more common was the kind of narrator you would see like in Flaubert's A Simple Heart or Tagore's Punishment, who knows everything and presents it to you clearly. That was the typical narrator of realism. Now you have the underground type of man being the type of narrator you see all the time. You even have authors like Marcel Proust from France, who was one of the prominent high modernists, making himself a character in the story, making himself the narrator, even though it's complete fiction. And so you can't trust a narrator because you can't trust the world around you in modernism. Another example of this interiority was stream of consciousness, which Virginia Woolf, who along with James Joyce was one of the kind of forerunners of bringing stream of consciousness into literature, called it disconnected, incoherent patterns of the mind. So you'd all of a sudden, you might have a realist writer spend some time describing the thoughts of what's going on in a character's head. Realist writers, we didn't look at enough examples. Some of them would spend pages upon pages describing what's happening inside a character's head. That's why realist novels were so long. Flaubert invented that free and direct discourse, which kind of broke with that pattern of showing you the character's thoughts. But in realism, immediately these are the character's thoughts, and they're very clear and coherent. With modernism, you don't know. All of a sudden, you're inside the character's head, and you don't know if this is dialogue or whose mind it is, because the narrator doesn't tell you that. So you have to kind of stop, look carefully to try to figure out whose mind you're in, and then the thoughts are completely incoherent. They'll jump all around. But modernists felt this was much more realistic, and that's how people's minds really work, especially the mind of the modern human person. Some other kind of experimental things you would see is the breaking the fourth wall, especially in plays and drama. If you've seen the Deadpool movies or read those comics, he does that a lot. That's where the characters talk to the audience. And you saw more explicit subject matter. The realists and those writers before them really wanted to keep things clean. But after the events of modernity, not the case. So especially with sexuality, you see this in D.H. Lawrence was kind of one of the first authors to, just have explicit sex scenes in his novels, and some of them were banned. But this was certainly becoming more the norm. One last statement on this was the task of art to break through habitual assumptions, to show the world as strange and new. That was the task of art. Breaking through the assumptions of the past. Because the world was strange and new, writers wanted to depict the worlds in their literary works as strange and new. And you see that very clearly in the examples we're going to read. But I think it really comes back to that idea of a search for a cohesive society. Is that possible in the modern world? That'll be one of our central questions going forward. So I hope you have a more thorough understanding of modernism now. Like I said, there's a lot of background, but now we'll spend some time with L.U. Jun's Diary of a Madman, and we won't need to look at that much background and context for a while because modernism is just so complex. And I know right now it might still seem kind of vague to you, but these writers are really going to help us flesh it out. I think Diary of a Madman is a perfect example. Okay, so most scholars agree, that's why I use the word consensus there, that Liu Jun was one of the true, authentic geniuses of Chinese literature. Even though he did not produce that much, he only wrote 25 short stories, no novels, in an 8-year period from 1918 to 26. And Liu Jun was his pen name. I'm working very hard to pronounce things as clearly as possible, so I'm not going to dabble in trying to pronounce his birth name. We'll just stick with the pen name. He was born into a family of Confucian scholar officials and became a great classical scholar himself. So this is something to take note of because the book, or the story, this plays a part in it. Because there's the little introduction before the story itself, and that little introduction is more representative of classical Chinese rather than the newer kind of literary movements. And we'll talk about that more as we go here. So at this time in China, there was a lot of change and upheaval, and one of those was in the education system, where basically you had to learn the Confucian classics. And people were saying, well, are these classics really that important? So kind of the classical system of education was giving way to a more modern one. And Jun was one of the proponents of that. Even though he'd had a classical upbringing, he wasn't necessarily a believer that people still needed to learn all of that. At age 15, as early as then, he was pursuing this more modern education, and people would often travel abroad to Japan for it because Japan was modernizing in similar ways and had started a little bit earlier than China. So he took part in that and went to Japan for a while. He saw a lot of change and war and upheaval in his life. But one of the things he saw was the Russians and the Japanese were at war in the Chinese territory of Manchuria. He bore witness to that. And seeing that war there was incredibly influential on him. He saw an image of a prisoner being executed, and he had originally planned to go into the medical field. But when he saw that image of a prisoner being executed, he decided to write instead of become a doctor because he, in his words, this is a quote, he wanted to heal spirits, not bodies. He wanted to heal people's souls. Comes back to that idea of the changes, the influence literature can have on a society. As a doctor, he could heal people who were hurt, but he couldn't necessarily stop them from being tortured or being killed before they arrived in his hospital bed. But maybe he could change the minds of people through his literature. Really important piece of context was the Republican Revolution of 1911. On the modernity slide, we talked about the Russian Revolution that led to the shift from a monarchical society to a communist one. Very similar in China a little bit earlier, 1911. Communists overthrew the last imperial dynasty, and the country kind of slowly from that point became a communist state. So he lived through, you got to think about this. He was born toward the end of the 19th century and lived to about the mid-20th century. So he saw this kind of change. He saw the shift from a monarchical to a communist society. How many people see that kind throughout world history? How many people have lived through that kind of change? This is how you get the stories we get here and why the stories are so interesting. Another important event he lived through was the May 4th movement. He became very politically active late in his life, kind of to go along with the writing because he wanted the writing to change people, like I said. And he wasn't part of this protest, but he supported it. And basically, there was the signing of some treaties at the end of World War I that would have given Japan control of the Shandong province in China. And student protests actually, a lot of times people protest, nothing changes. This protest was actually successful, which is really cool. And so it worked, and China didn't sign that particular part of the treaty, or they got the other signees to amend it, and Shandong was not given over to Japan. Japan was an expanding empire at this time, so that was significant. And the political activism I mentioned from late in his life made him a favorite writer of Mao Zedong. We talked about Stalin a little bit, and Mao and Stalin are very different, but they're both known for being the leaders of communist countries, and lots and lots of people being executed under them, essentially genocide taking place under their watch, or in Stalin's case, under their direct order. And so Mao's a controversial figure because he did all kinds of things to modernize China, and a lot of those modern achievements were really good things, more rights for women and things like that. But at the same time, all these people executed, under his watch. And so he's an incredibly controversial figure. We're covering so many writers, which, our course is kind of focused on quantity rather than depth. If it was an entirely Chinese literature course, we'd talk about Mao in great detail. I don't have time now, so you can look him up. But suffice to say, Zhen's political activities supported communism, so he was a favorite of Mao. All right, let's take a look at the work itself. I want to try to encourage you now. You might see this story as bleak, and if so, I can see why. In those slides on modernism are bleak. I didn't intend them to be that bleak, and then you kind of have all that information in front of you, and it's a bit overwhelming. Out of all of this tragedy of the 20th century, some really beautiful pieces of writing emerged, and I think the beauty of the art itself gives people hope. If you think back to Baudelaire, he's rightfully placed chronologically in the Romantic period, but as I said in the Baudelaire lecture, he was really like the first modernist. And so that idea of the beauty and the grotesque merging there is a very modern thing. And so you have a work like Diary of a Madman where you're kind of like, what is going on? But it's this really fascinating, intriguing piece of literature. And it really is representative of the crises of modernism, but at the same time, it's such a wonderful piece of literature. Just the fact that it is a wonderful piece of literature and that kind of literature can exist under these conditions should give us hope. And I think that's really the purpose of modernism. So that's what I'd like to leave you with, but to get there, we have to look at the story. So what are some of the interesting threads? Well, irony is at the core of this story. This story is all based around a structural system of above the surface and below the surface. So what's really going on in this community is the question. And is the madman our narrator? He's obviously an unreliable narrator. He's a madman. Is he right? Are people actually cannibals? Is he wrong? Are they not cannibals? But even if he's wrong, is he crazy? Because does cannibalism really represent the brutality of modern society? So it's a very ironic story. Irony is probably its key tactic. And so you have to ask people who are saying there's no cannibalism, is that just a veneer and people are really brutal or cannibalistic at heart? That's kind of the central tension or struggle here. The textbook calls the language in the story immediate, genuine, and direct. I think that's very much true. But what's important to note when the textbook is discussing this is something we'll come back to, is you have that opening passage from this guy this other narrator, who I think we have to assume is more of a reliable narrator, says, I found this diary of my old school friend. And my old school friend's older brother says that person is now doing fine, even though he was mad for quite a while. And so we really have, this is what we call a frame. a frame narrative. We have a story within a story. And so we really have to think about, what does it mean? Because we see him and his older brother at tension at the end of the story. But years later, the preface tells us that years later, they're like supposedly fine. Everything's hunky dory. So is that true? And if so, what does it mean that the madman apparently recovered from the spell of madness? There's a narrow focus here with this unreliable narrator. So we have to keep in mind the world shrinks for him as he goes more and more insane. His world is getting smaller. He's kind of criticizing people, you could say, for having a narrow view of things, that brutality beneath the surface. But at the same time, the only possibility in his mind is that they're hypocrites. He can't get outside that perspective. That's all he can see. So his perspective is perhaps just as narrow as the people he's critiquing. And we have to ask the question, is he a hypocrite? I didn't mean to have the colon there, and I apologize for that. Central question of the story. This is the big question we'll come back to at the end. Is the narrator actually crazy, or is he the only sane person? That's the typical device of the modernist writer. One of the most famous modernist novels is William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying. It's about a family where the mother, the matriarch of the family, dies. And they decide, she has the husband and I believe it's 5 children, 4 boys and a girl, and they decide to go into town. They live out in the country, and they have her in the coffin, and they tied the coffin back to the wagon and drive it into town. And you have one of the brothers, Darrell Bundren, eventually goes crazy, and the book ends with him in a mental institution. But the whole time, if you try to look at the situation, this family is dragging this coffin through the city, and vultures are circling it because there's this rotting body inside. Darrell's the only one. The guy who ends up in the mental institution is the only one saying, is this crazy what we're doing? Why are we dragging this corpse everywhere? And the other characters are making selfish choices that, if you try to look at it from a perspective outside that family, a more objective perspective, Darrell might be the sane one and everyone else is crazy. That's like the point of that story. And so this is a modernist trope, to have a seemingly crazy character be the only sane person. So the most important question we'll ask of this story is the narrator crazy and everyone else is sane? Or is the narrator sane and everyone else crazy? Who's the true madman here? Madman in air quotes. So that's the central question. But I want to look at a few more threads here that help us arrive at how we try to answer this question. So the fluidity of language. When he's establishing that the people in the community are cannibals, he takes things people say and interprets them a different way than you might expect just kind of an ordinary person to interpret those words. And so the modernists really believed language was fluid, and that was one of the kind of their experimental techniques, was experimenting with language, and you see that here. And we'll see that in the first quote we look at. Language and education equal power. One of the effects people really saw during modernity was the sovereign power. How could something like the Holocaust happen? Well, someone has power and other members of society don't, and they exercise that power in an abusive, destructive way. And so power dynamics within different societies are very much important to the modernists, and we see that here. We'll look at a quote that explores it between the narrator and his elder brother. Another concept central to understanding this story is the concept of homo sacer, or bare life. That's a translation from the Latin. And it was a Roman law, which basically meant a banned person could be killed by anyone. So if under Roman law, as a citizen, you were deemed homo sacer, or bare life, then anyone could kill you. You couldn't be sacrificed to the gods because you were unclean. You were banned. But anyone could just kill you, and it wouldn't be a crime. It sounds pretty horrible, right? And so this is the idea that one person in society is singled out as the outsider, or not belonging. And so this has become kind of a theme over the years in some literary works. There's a philosopher, Agamben, Giorgio Agamben, has a book called Homo Sacer, Sovereign Power and Bare Life that explores this concept. It's a really interesting book if you ever read it, because he's basically saying, in a society with a lot of sovereign powers, anyone can become bare life, and that's essentially how something like the Holocaust happens. Is other people are declared, their lives are declared expendable by those in power. And the narrator in Diary of a Madman makes a case that that's happening to him. Cracks in the walls of Sandy is another thing I wanted to identify. So some of the dialogue alludes to the possibility that maybe cannibalism is actually happening. When he talks about it, it's not as shocking to the people around him as it should be, even though they're denying it. So if you see kind of a wall visually between the narrator and the other characters in the community, it's not as solid of a wall as you think. There are cracks in it, and the dialogue alludes to that. But then again, we have to ask, are those cracks legitimate? Because he's an unreliable narrator, and other than the preface, he's our only source of information. These are kind of the questions the modernists want their readers to ask. Can we even trust the text itself? And finally, he alludes to the idea over and over again that we don't have to be cannibals. We can make a better or a different choice. And so I think this text, for that reason, most definitely takes part in the modernist search for a new type of cohesive society. Remember, it would be new. We can't go back, but it would be cohesive like the old society would be. Is that even possible? I think the narrator thinks it is. And so that's another way in which we can ask, is he a madman or not? All right, let's look at a few passages from the text to see how these ideas build on one another. So you have the fluidity of language in the first passage here. That's really the first one. It's a mother talking to her child, and that's really the first instance where he extrapolates from that cannibalism. Strangest of all was that woman on the street. She slapped her son and said, "Damn it all, you've got me so riled up I could take a good bite right out of your hide." She was talking to him, but she was looking at me. I tried but couldn't conceal a shudder of fright. That's when that ghastly crew of people with their green faces and protruding fangs began to roar with laughter. So you have a character here who I think is a little bit similar to the Underground Man. I think the Underground Man is kind of a precursor to modernism. And he's very concerned, like the Underground Man, with people seeing him and how he appears to those people. And part of that, though, the kind of the layer this text adds to that trope is he thinks they're going to eat him. Now, we've probably all said at one point in our life, like, we were so angry with someone, I could just kill you. But we didn't really mean we were going to kill that person. So this mother is so angry with her child, her son, that she says, I could take a bite right out of you. She probably doesn't mean that, but the narrator takes it as literal. Perhaps because he wants to see it that way. We're not, because that's not clear, it's vague, but he takes it literally. And so she says one thing, he takes it another way. You have the fluidity of language. I said that language, so we have the idea that language is fluid. It can be manipulated by people for different means. The narrator here is manipulating it to make the case to his readers that the people around him are cannibals, that they're going to eat him. So language is fluid. Bookmark that. We're going to build on that and add another layer. You combine language with education, because as we've talked about before, language is an incredibly important part of education. You have power, and we've already talked about how important power dynamics are to the modernists and to the story. So let's see how that works. You have to remember that the narrator is the younger brother of the two brothers, and it says over and over again, every time it refers to the other brother, it says the elder brother. In the U.S. today, being the older the younger brother might not make that much of a difference, but in many societies it did, especially in China, especially pre-modern China. And so the older brother has a lot of responsibility here. And I think they kind of, a lot of power. I mean, it kind of alludes to the idea that I think their parents died young, or their father did, so the older brother was really responsible for educating the narrator. And the quote I'm about to read to you comes after he's described his older brother teaching him the Chinese classics. Remember, the author Zhun had this classical education, but at the time he thought, well, maybe that's not the way to go. Maybe we need a more modern version of education. The narrator was educated in that same classical tradition by his brother. And so we can see the connections between the author and the work there. And he shares an example of a story he learned in that classical education tradition that apparently had people eating children. So he says, if it's all right to exchange children and eat them, then anyone can be exchanged. Anyone can be eaten. Back then, I just took what he said as explanation of the classics and let it go at that. But now I realize that while he was explaining, the grease of human flesh was smeared all over his lips. And what's more, his mind was filled with plans for further cannibalism. So you have him basically afraid of the power his brother has in that quote that anyone can be exchanged. Children are usually so valued by society. If a society were willing to sacrifice them, then he's saying anyone could be sacrificed. And that makes him feel vulnerable, which is part of the story. His modern condition is feeling very vulnerable. So, is his brother's face really stained with the grease of human flesh? Are the people in the previous quote really have green faces and protruding fangs? I don't know, but maybe he's not describing their physical appearance. Maybe he's describing what's going on in their hearts, and maybe that's the point of the story. I think it's worth exploring further. We'll look at a couple more quotes here. I talked about the cracks. There's a really interesting conversation he has with a 20-year-old man. It's the only description of him, where he's talking about cannibalism. And the man says, he's kind of taken aback, but he says, except perhaps in a famine year, how can anyone get eaten? What's interesting about this is this guy, just like everyone else, is denying that cannibalism is happening. But at the same time, he's saying, well, maybe in a famine. Wouldn't the idea of cannibalism be so shocking? You'd be like, not at all, ever? I mean, what kind of conditions lead one to believe that even in something as extreme as a famine, cannibalism could happen? These are the cracks we see. But again, we have to ask, is this passage only there because the narrator's unreliable? I don't know. I talked about the narrator's allusion to the modernist search for a new type of cohesive society. He says the cannibalism is a choice. They can help it, he says. And yet all they'd have to do is turn back, change, and then everything would be fine. Even though people may say it's always been like this, we can still do our best to improve, and we can start today. So it's a call to action to forego the cannibalism. Is this possible? I don't know. He thinks it is. But the language here is really interesting. All they'd have to do is turn back, change. But people say it's always been like this. So I think you live in a modern world, you live under some extremely brutal conditions, you just begin to believe that's the only option. He's saying, no, it's not the only option. Maybe that's what makes him sane. The question is not whether he's an outsider or not. He's an outsider. He is the only person in his society like him. But the question is, he's the only one like him. So is he sane or insane? What's the norm, to be sane or insane? You know, that question comes up over and over again. This is one example of it. Finally, I talked about that idea of homo sacer or bare life. Someone society deems as such an outsider that they can be just, they're disposable. We saw that idea start to emerge on the last slide when he said, if children could be sacrificed, anyone could be. We see the extension of that here close to the end of the story. Now I'm on to another of their tricks. Not only are they unwilling to change, but they're already setting me up for their next cannibalistic feast by labeling me a madman. That way they'll be able to eat me without getting into the slightest trouble. Some people will even be grateful to them. Wasn't that the very trick used in the case that the tenant reported? Everybody ganged up on a bad man and ate him. It's the same old thing. Same old thing, the idea that the concept of bare life has been around since Roman times. And so, like I said with the last quote, he's definitely the outsider here. The question is, he's sane or not? And then the other question is, that comes with this quote is, if he's being labeled an outsider, then he's expendable. He could be eaten. I mean, I think cannibalism is an exaggeration or a metaphor here for the brutality of modern society. But when you see the loss of life in the 20th century, it's kind of believable, right? Like, of all of the things I listed on the first slide, the conditions of modernity, what was the most shocking, most horrifying thing to people in the 20th century? Perhaps it was the idea that some individuals in a society could be deemed expendable. This man may be crazy, but that's how he believes society sees him. And that's a concerning thing. All right, so what do we learn from all this? I think I'm only left with questions. And it wouldn't be a good modernist work if I had any answers. They all have to be questions in a good modernist work. We talked more about the narrator as unreliable. Is he also hypocritical? He's critiquing society's inability to see the brutality beneath the surface. He's saying, can't you see people are eating each other? And again, it's like a metaphor. In the modern world, people aren't literally eating each other, but they're doing things to each other that are almost just as bad. He's saying, can't you see that? But like I said, because he seems to be slowly going more insane, his world is narrowing. So can we trust that view? And then I think a question, pause and really think about this. It could be one of your threads that you could maybe build into a thesis. In what ways does cannibalism represent the horrors of modernity? I think I've listed a few, but I'm sure you can come up with more. There's so many. One way to think about it would be that people are, as they're seemingly more connected by airplanes and telephones, they're actually disconnected. I mean, how often do we talk to our neighbors anymore? Even though we live in urban spaces close to our neighbors, that's a very modern convention. And so, I think one of the most shocking things to people, in addition to the idea that some people in society are expendable, is that people don't seem to care as much about each other. If killing comes so easily, how much does one human being really care about another human being? I think that's an idea central to this story. With that context in mind, is it possible for a new society to be cohesive? I pause there because we should ponder it. Is it? What could pull all the pieces together? And I think for me, it has to always come back to Dostoevsky's The Underground Man, or Notes from Underground. That scene where Liza embraces the underground man. He's cruel and horrible to her, and she embraces him. And he says, because she sensed that beneath it all, he was unhappy. That to me is the turning point. A love like Jesus's. We have to turn to the person next to us and say, no matter what you do to me, I know you're suffering, and I want to love you. I want to help you because of that. I think we actually have to look back to texts like Dostoevsky to have the answer to the problems of modernity, to the suffering of the modern human person. Finally, the most important question, is the narrator sane or insane? Is he the only sane person? Or is he crazy like everyone thinks? I think it might not even matter that much. I think getting us to ask that question is the point of the story. It's getting us to see, even if people aren't really eating each other, they're doing things that are basically like eating each other. And the one person who's pointing it out is labeled as an outsider and expendable. I think he's outlined the problem of modern society right there. And I think it's a beautiful story because it shows us that. But it doesn't give us the answers because that's not the purpose. It wants us to ask the questions. But if we do want an answer, then we have to look back to Notes of Underground and see the kind of unselfish, totally self-sacrificial love that is the only kind of love that can combat the kind of suffering this text depicts.